Hey guys, tonight we're starting something a bit different. A slow, steady descent into the life of a man who went from stealing tombstones to running the most powerful drug empire in the world. But before all that, he was just a kid. Just Pablo, and no one knew what he would become. So if you're settling in for the night, maybe light a candle, get a blanket, and let's ease into it together. Like always, like and subscribe if you enjoy these calm journeys into uncomfortable places, and let me know in the comments what country you're watching from. I'm always curious. Let's be clear, no one in the dusty hills of Antioquia looked at little Pablo and thought, that boy is going to be on every wanted list on the planet. He wasn't born with a gold spoon, or even a silver one. He had dirt under his nails, scrapes on his knees, and a mother who stretched every peso. His father was a farmer, quiet and stern. His mother, a school teacher with high hopes and limited means. They didn't raise a monster. They raised a boy, a clever one. A boy who watched closely, listened quietly, and always knew who had the nicest shoes in the room. Colombia in the 1950s and 60s wasn't gentle. There were dreams, yes, but they came with warnings. If you wanted to rise, you had to climb with your elbows out and your head down. Pablo did, but not through books or good grades. His business education came from street corners, whispered deals, and learning how to smile while stealing your wallet. He wasn't violent. Not yet. He was just smart, and more importantly, he was patient. His first ventures weren't dramatic. He didn't start with cocaine or planes or politicians. He started small, stealing gravestones, polishing the names off, and reselling them. It sounds absurd, almost comedic, but that was the point. No one notices the kid who's just making money quietly. No one suspects the boy at the edge of the cemetery, but Pablo noticed everything. He noticed which police took bribes, which shopkeepers hid extra inventory, and which politicians liked envelopes more than speeches. Then came the cars. Stolen, stripped, and flipped. He didn't drive them. He sold them, clean, quiet, quick cash, and with every peso he reinvested, not in stocks or property, in people. He bought loyalty one favor at a time, a loan here, a helping hand there. Soon, people owed him things, small things, but they added up. Pablo didn't build an empire overnight. He built a network, and that's what mattered. By the early 1970s, he had contacts in politics, in customs, in neighborhoods. People didn't say no to Pablo, not because they were afraid, but because they remembered the time he paid their aunt's medical bill or got their cousin out of jail. He wasn't just a crook. He was a provider, a fixer, someone who got things done. That image would stay with him long after he stopped being quiet. But let's not pretend he was innocent. He wasn't. By the time he was 25, he was smuggling cigarettes, fake lottery tickets, and appliances through back roads and bribed checkpoints. He didn't ask if it was legal. He asked if it worked. And if it did, he did it again. His logic was simple. If the system is broken, use the cracks. Then came the real money, the white dust. Cocaine wasn't yet the international juggernaut it would become, but it was rising, and Pablo saw it coming like a wave on the horizon. Others laughed. too risky, too new, too foreign. But Pablo didn't laugh. He watched, he waited, and when the time came, he stepped forward with both feet. Not because he loved the product. He didn't even use it, but he understood one thing better than most. Addiction isn't just chemical. It's economic. The world wanted something. He could supply it. That was enough. And so began the next chapter. Not with blood, not yet, but with cargo, hidden in tires, buried in fruit, stuffed into suitcases. He learned the routes. He paid the guards. He used old trucks, young couriers, and maps so detailed they made pilots nervous. Every shipment that made it through made the next one easier, and with every load, the profit grew. $10,000 became 50. 50 became 200. Until one day, the numbers got too big to count without a calculator. At some point, Pablo stopped thinking in pesos. Dollars were easier, cleaner. They stacked better, stored better, counted better, and they looked better too. He didn't hoard them like a miser. He moved them like a strategist. Some went into property. Some went into favors. Most went into silence. You don't build a criminal empire with noise. You build it with envelopes, eye contact, and the understanding that no one likes to go home empty-handed. But the business was growing. Fast. Too fast to be small anymore. The days of smuggling suitcases through airports and cars across borders were fading. The market had outgrown the mules. What it needed now was something bigger. So Pablo bought planes. Not jets. Just cargo planes. Unassuming. Low-flying. Often old. But they worked. And that was enough. They flew low. Sometimes below radar. Sometimes through gaps in weather. Packed tight with powder. Fueled by bribes. And cleared for landing by people who owed him a favor. And when the planes weren't enough, he got creative. Submarines, boats, converted buses. Anything with a bottom and an engine could be used. Anything that moved could be paid. The money rolled in. But it didn't come alone. It brought problems, bigger problems. Problems with uniforms and briefcases. Problems with microphones and warrants. And eventually, problems with guns. The cocaine boom didn't just make Pablo rich. It made him visible, and visibility is dangerous when your product is illegal in every country that can afford it. Still, Pablo didn't blink. He adapted. If someone asked too many questions, he gave them answers they couldn't repeat. If someone got in the way, he moved through them. Quietly, if possible. Loudly, if necessary. That's when the killings began. Not random, not messy, just practical. A judge here, a cop there, a rival who forgot the rules. Pablo didn't enjoy it, but he understood it. Business wasn't just about supply and demand. It was about survival. And sometimes survival meant sending a message. So he sent them in car bombs, in bullet holes, in funerals that came too early and lasted too long. But he didn't only send fear. He sent money too. To neighborhoods, to schools, to hospitals. He built fields for children who had never seen grass. He paid for surgeries, textbooks, running water. In Medellin, Pablo wasn't just a criminal. He was a benefactor, a provider, a strange mix of saint and shadow. People whispered about his crimes, but they spoke louder about his gifts. Still, the law didn't care about soccer fields. The law cared about drugs, and the Americans, well, they were louder than the law. They wanted him gone, not arrested, gone. So Pablo did what he always did. He looked for an advantage, and he found it. In politics. In 1982, he ran for office, and he won. Not a big office, not enough to write laws, but enough to shake hands, enough to be called honorable, enough to walk into places with a suit and a smile and not be asked questions. For a while, it worked. But only for a while, because politics is a different kind of business, one with long memories and short patience. And when people found out where his money came from, the handshakes got colder, the smiles faded, the invitations stopped. He was asked to leave, not politely, not quietly, and Pablo took that personally. He didn't forget. He didn't forgive. He just watched, waited, built. Because if power wouldn't accept him, he would build a new kind of power, one made of dollars, fear, and devotion, one with no elections, no debates, no rules except his own. The Medellin cartel wasn't born overnight, but when it came fully formed. A machine, sleek and brutal, with Pablo at its head, calm and unshakable. He wasn't the only drug lord, but he was the most effective, and the most careful. He didn't get high on his own product. He got high on control, on precision, on watching the world bend slowly toward his will. But with growth came weight, pressure, eyes, enemies, and the days of quiet theft were long behind him. Ahead lay something else. Bombs, battles, hostages. A war not just against the government, but against time itself. By the mid-1980s, Pablo wasn't just a name. He was a force, a presence, a weight that hung over cities and countries and dinner tables. His network stretched across oceans. His money moved faster than couriers could count. And his power no longer came from persuasion. It came from consequence. In Colombia, there was a phrase that echoed through every courtroom and police station. Plata o plomo. Silver or lead. You take the bribe, or you take the bullet. And most people took the bribe. Not because they were greedy, but because they had families. Because they liked waking up in the morning and going home at night. Because the choice wasn't really a choice. It was a sentence. And Pablo knew that. He didn't need everyone to love him. He just needed enough people to stay quiet, to look the other way, to nod politely when his name came up in conversation, and then change the subject. But even fear has limits. The Colombian government was under pressure from newspapers, from citizens, and most of all, from the United States. America wanted results. Seizures, arrests, headlines, and when the headlines didn't come fast enough, they sent help, advisors, equipment, surveillance. Words like extradition started appearing in legal documents. Words Pablo didn't like, because extradition meant leaving Colombia. It meant facing trial in a country where his money and power meant nothing. It meant prison without visitors, courtrooms without bribes. It meant disappearing. And Pablo Escobar did not disappear. So he made a choice. He declared war, not the kind of war with uniforms and treaties, the kind with motorcycles and briefcases, with dynamite and phone calls. Judges were murdered. Police were ambushed. Journalists were shot in broad daylight. Planes were bombed. Entire buildings reduced to rubble. It wasn't targeted anymore. It was loud, public, terrifying. It didn't matter if you were involved or not. If you were nearby, you were in danger. And yet, even as the bombs exploded, Pablo's grip remained firm. His cartel ran like a corporation. Planes flew on time. Payments were made. Routes were maintained. And profits soared. Billions of dollars moved through his network every year. So much cash that it was buried in fields, stacked in warehouses, eaten by rats before it could be spent. He bought entire neighborhoods, entire towns. He controlled airports, judges, banks. His empire wasn't a myth. It was real, and it was too big to hide, but it was also too big to protect. The violence, once useful, became excessive, chaotic. Children died, tourists fled, citizens marched. They didn't see a Robin Hood anymore. They saw a tyrant, a man whose anger left bodies in the street and blood on the walls. And the government, pushed to the edge, struck back. They formed special units, task forces, partnerships with foreign intelligence, and Pablo, for the first time, felt surrounded. But he didn't panic. He pivoted. He offered a deal, one that sounded impossible. He would surrender, but only on his terms. No extradition, no foreign trials, no exposure. He would serve time, yes, but in a prison of his own design. A prison he would build himself. One where he chose the guards, the rules, the walls. They called it La Catedral, the cathedral. And strangely, the government agreed because they were tired. Because the violence was endless. Because the people wanted peace. Because sometimes you take a bad deal to stop a worse one. So Pablo surrendered. Cameras flashed. Statements were made. And for a brief moment, it looked like the story was ending. But La Catedral wasn't a prison. It was a palace, with gardens, televisions, kitchens, billiards, parties. He wasn't confined. He was crowned. Visitors came and went. Business continued. Enemies were tortured inside its walls. And the government, embarrassed, powerless, pretended not to notice, until they couldn't pretend anymore, until the corruption got too obvious, until even silence became too loud. Then they made a new plan. Move him, transfer him, take control. But Pablo Escobar didn't like surprises. When he learned what was coming, he vanished through a tunnel, into a forest, into the fog, just like that. Gone again. And now, the real hunt had begun. For most fugitives, escape means panic. A stolen car, a bag of cash, a blind dash for the border. For Pablo, it was different. Escape was methodical, planned, quiet. He didn't run into the jungle. He disappeared into infrastructure, into farms, safe houses, hills he had paid for years in advance, roads no one patrolled, towns that owed him everything. He wasn't hiding. He was relocating. And yet, for the first time, he wasn't in control. The government had changed. The people had changed. What used to be quiet cooperation turned into quiet resistance. Neighbors stopped opening their doors. Old allies stopped answering calls. The man who had once bought loyalty with cash and comfort now found the country colder and the police louder. They had help. Foreign advisors, new surveillance, satellites, listening devices. Intelligence Pablo had once laughed at was now tracing his steps. He moved often, never sleeping twice in the same place. No more fancy suits, no more polished shoes, just mud, darkness, and whispered orders. He shaved his beard. He changed his walk. But the weight stayed. The stress, the watching, the waiting. For a man who once owned the sky, he now studied the ground with every step, and behind him, the empire crumbled. The Medellin cartel had always been more than Pablo, but without him at the center, it fractured. Rivalries bloomed. Partners turned enemies. The loyalty he had once bought with ease now came with conditions and violence. Lots of it. Streets once ruled by certainty now belonged to chaos. Gangs fought for territory. Police raided safe houses. Planes stopped flying. The flow of drugs didn't stop, but it slowed, and with it, the money. Pablo still had some, hidden in barrels, buried under sheds. But it wasn't endless. It was never as endless as it looked. And now it was going faster than it came, because every day cost something. A bribe here, a vehicle there, a courier who needed to be quiet. Money was a parachute, but he was falling too fast. He tried to rebuild, piece by piece. Old roots, trusted men. But it wasn't the same. Too many eyes, too many voices, and too many enemies. Not just the government, not just the Americans, but the people who had once stood beside him. The Cali cartel, quiet, well-dressed, calculating. While Pablo had ruled with noise and fire, they moved like diplomats. They didn't want fame. They wanted power. And now, they wanted him gone. They had resources, influence, patience, and they used all of it. Bribes, leaks, information, not to capture him, to corner him, to shrink his world until he had nowhere left to turn. And it worked. The walls closed in. Slowly, but tightly. Pablo still fought back. He called in favors, sent messages, hid in places only he remembered. He saw his wife and children in secret, wrapped in night and fear. He kept a radio by his bed, listening, always listening, to police chatter, to news reports, to the growing sense that time was running out. He couldn't walk into town anymore, couldn't call without risk, couldn't breathe too loudly. But still, he dreamed of safety, of escape, of maybe one more chance to leave it all behind. A deal, a plane, a quiet house, somewhere warm. He even sent messages, promising surrender, asking for terms. But no one answered. Not anymore. The world had moved on. He was a symbol now, a ghost in the headlines, a threat that needed to be erased, not reasoned with. His last months were a blur, not of violence, but of waiting, waiting for the knock, the voice, the flash of light before the door gives way. He moved again, another rooftop, another house. His circle was shrinking. The city, once his, now watched him like prey. He had lost the war, not in battle, but in silence, in erosion, in the slow collapse of everything he built. And then, the call, December the 2nd, 1993. A small apartment, not far from where it all began. He made a call to his son, a short call, a few words, a voice cracking under the weight of too much distance. And somewhere, a signal traced it. A unit moved, not loud, not fast, but final. And Pablo didn't run. He heard them coming, the steps, the shouts, the scramble. He climbed to the roof, not to escape, just to move, to breathe, to see the sky one more time. And then, the shots. No speech, no last stand, just footsteps, gunfire, silence. Pablo Escobar died on a rooftop, surrounded, alone, not in a mansion, not in a courtroom, but in mud-stained sneakers, holding a gun he never fired. After the gunshots, there was no announcement, no fanfare, just the thud of a body hitting tile, a pause, then the boots. Police moved in slowly, carefully, as if expecting a trick. But there was none, just Pablo, lying on the rooftop, a small pool of blood forming beneath him, a pistol still in his hand, but unused. Whatever war he had been fighting was over, and this was the final page. The news spread fast, faster than any of his planes, faster than the lies that once protected him. Pablo Escobar was dead. Headlines printed it in bold. Radios repeated it every hour. Television crews stood outside the building, pointing at the balcony, the windows, the narrow street where it ended. In Medellin, people whispered. Some smiled. Some cried. Some didn't believe it, because for years he had been everywhere, in stories, in fears, in rumors, in money, in violence, in cement walls built with blood. And now, suddenly, gone, just like that. A rooftop, a few bullets, and silence. Some said he was shot by police. Others claimed he took his own life. The truth, as always, faded beneath the weight of stories. But the outcome was the same. The man who ruled with bombs and bribes was no longer breathing. His body was taken away quickly. His family was notified. His enemies celebrated. And his legacy began to rot in real time. The empire he had built didn't vanish instantly, but the cracks widened. The cartel, already shaking, began to fracture. His most loyal men scattered. Some were arrested, some were killed, some just disappeared. No one wanted to wear the crown he left behind. It was too heavy, too dangerous, too full of ghosts. Money dried up. Safe houses were raided. Accounts were frozen. Families fled. Properties were seized. And the name Escobar, once whispered with fear and awe, became a risk, a reason for arrest, a reason for suspicion. It didn't protect anymore. It painted a target. The people closest to him faced choices. His wife and children had to move, to change names, to find a life in a world that no longer had room for them. Countries turned them away. Airports delayed them. Reporters followed them. Everyone wanted to know what came next. But there was no next. Just exile. Just survival. Just the slow rebuilding of something that would never look like normal. Back in Medellin, the neighborhood he had once built in the hills mourned him. Some of them, at least. The houses he paid for. The clinics. The fields. The schools. They remained. Cracked. Faded. But standing. People remembered the help. The groceries. The shoes for school. The money when rent was due. And they wondered, if a man could be both monster and savior, what should they call him now? Elsewhere, he was not mourned. Victims, families, judges, journalists, police officers who had lived in fear or not lived at all. For them, his death was overdue. Not justice, exactly, but closure. An end to a name that had filled too many funerals, too many empty chairs at dinner, too many sleepless nights. The government claimed victory. Photographs were printed. Smiles were forced. Statements were made. But no one forgot how long it took, how many lives it cost, and how close they had come to losing. Pablo had embarrassed them, outrun them, outshot them, outsmarted them, for years. And in the end, it wasn't a grand operation that stopped him. It was a phone call, a trace, a moment. But the scars remained. Colombia didn't heal overnight. The violence didn't vanish with Pablo's last breath. The cartels continued. Smaller, yes. More careful, but still dangerous. The drugs still flowed. The corruption still lingered. Pablo was gone, but the system that allowed him to rise hadn't changed completely. Not yet. And yet, something shifted. There was no longer one man to fear, no central figure to blame. The myth had been broken. The rooftop had ended it. And that mattered, because myths give power. And without him, the narrative changed. People began to speak louder, to demand more, to hope, cautiously, for something better. In the years that followed, his story was told again and again, in books, in shows, in films. Some painted him as evil, others as tragic, but all missed something. The quiet parts, the slow build, the tired eyes, the silence before the bombs. The man who once sold stolen gravestones before learning that powder paid more. The truth is, Pablo Escobar wasn't a legend. He was a man, brilliant, brutal, and broken. He didn't want to be a hero. He wanted control. And for a while, he had it. He shaped a country with fear and dollars. He touched lives with bullets and bills. And when it ended, there was no speech, no message, no final word, just a radio, a breath, and then nothing. Long after the rooftop turned quiet, the questions remained, not about how he died, but how he lived, how a boy from a poor village became the richest criminal in history, how a man with no uniform, no title, no army, once held an entire nation in the palm of his hand. And more curiously, why so many still talk about him, still study him, still argue about what he meant. Because Pablo Escobar wasn't simple. He was a contradiction. He paid for hospitals and ordered murders. He handed out school books and planted bombs. He built homes and tore cities apart, and in the space between those things, he became a puzzle, a figure too big to ignore, too dangerous to admire, too familiar to forget. His story didn't end with his death. In many ways, it began again. Writers took notes. Journalists collected interviews. Neighbors recalled details. Some true, some imagined, but all of them woven into the growing mythology. A man who buried millions in barrels, who built zoos and smuggled elephants, who had his own navy, his own air force, his own prison. Some of it was real, some of it wasn't, but all of it stuck, because the world wanted a story, something large, something cinematic. But the reality was quieter. After the chaos, after the empire, after the blood and the money, Pablo was just a man in hiding, shaving in the dark, listening to radios, moving through shadows. His final days were not filled with glory. They were filled with mud and fear. He wasn't untouchable anymore, just unpredictable. And then gone. The places he once ruled changed slowly. La Catedral, his prison palace, was stripped and abandoned. Its walls, once filled with laughter and crime, now echoed with dust and tourists. Later, monks moved in. They cleaned the rooms, rebuilt the chapel, turned the site into a place of silence. But even then, the legend lingered. Visitors still whispered his name as they walked past the walls. In Medellin, the zoo he built still existed. The animals, once symbols of wealth, had outlived their owner. His private hippos, left behind, bred in the wild. Decades later, they roamed rivers freely, a strange and unintended legacy. Wildlife experts tried to control the population. Locals debated what to do, but the animals stayed and multiplied, as if even nature refused to forget. His grave became a quiet landmark, not grand, not hidden, just a stone with a name. People visited. Some left flowers. Some left curses. Some just stood there, unsure what to feel. Because Pablo was not just a criminal, not just a name in a book. He was a mirror of greed, of ambition, of the cracks in a system that allowed him to rise. The government moved on. New officials, new plans, new slogans. But the memory of those years clung to the walls like soot. The years of bombings, the funerals, the silence after curfews. It didn't disappear. It settled in layers. Quiet reminders of what happens when power grows without limits. For those who lived through it, forgetting wasn't possible. The families of the victims still remembered the names, the faces, the phone calls that never came. For them, Pablo was not a myth. He was a thief, a killer, a reason someone didn't come home. And no amount of storytelling would change that. And yet, for others, especially the poor, the memory was more complicated. They remembered the medicine, the rent money, the food, the way he answered when no one else did. They didn't excuse what he did, but they didn't forget what he gave. And in that tension, a strange sort of loyalty lingered. Not loud, not proud, just present. His son, in time, tried to set the record straight. He spoke publicly, wrote books, explained the pain behind the fortune, the cost of being a child in a house of secrets. He condemned the violence, apologized for the blood, but the name stayed with him. Every interview, every question, a weight he didn't ask for, but carried anyway. Around the world, Pablo became a symbol for greed, for rebellion, for corruption. His image, once feared, was now printed on shirts, posters, television scripts. Young people who had never known the fear spoke his name like a legend, a character, a symbol of power, detached from the pain, detached from the truth. But real life isn't a story. It's slower, messier, full of doubt. Pablo Escobar was real. His crimes were real. His victims were real. And his end, quiet and undignified, was not a plot twist. It was the natural result of a life lived too fast, too loud, too far from safety. He had built a kingdom on cocaine and fear, and like all kingdoms without roots, it crumbled. What remains is memory, and the uncomfortable question, how did it get that far? To understand how it got that far, you have to go back, not to the rooftop, not to the prison, but to the beginning, to the dusty roads of Antioquia, to a boy who watched his mother stretch a paycheck, to a teenager who learned that favors last longer than rules, to a country where power didn't always wear a uniform, where money talked louder than the law, and silence was often the only thing that kept people safe. Colombia in the 1960s and 70s wasn't a blank canvas. It was already painted with inequality, corruption, and buried violence. The divide between rich and poor wasn't just visible, it was obvious. And in that gap, things festered. Pablo didn't invent corruption. He didn't create violence, but he saw how they worked, how they moved, and how easily they could be used. He wasn't born to be a kingpin, but he was born with eyes wide open. He learned early that laws bend for those who can afford to bend them, that politicians smiled wider when there was money on the table, that policemen had families too, and sometimes survival meant turning your head the other way. It wasn't about good or evil. It was about options. And Pablo saw more than most. What made him different wasn't charm. It wasn't violence. It was patience. He didn't just build an empire. He layered it, slowly, carefully. He didn't rush to power. He walked toward it. He watched others fall. He learned from their mistakes, and when he stepped forward, he did it without apology. The Medellin cartel wasn't built in a warehouse. It was built in boardrooms, backyards, kitchens, and mountain passes. It was built in cities and villages, built on trust and terror, on loyalty and lies. It didn't have a flag. It didn't have a motto, but it had a structure. One Pablo managed like a businessman, each route optimized, each courier known, each dollar accounted for, and beneath all of it was the unspoken truth. The product worked. Cocaine didn't need advertising. It didn't need politics. It needed only demand. And demand was endless. In the clubs of Miami, in the offices of New York, in the hands of people who didn't care where it came from, as long as it arrived. And Pablo made sure it did. He never used it, never trusted those who did. Because for him, cocaine wasn't pleasure. It was logistics. It was risk and reward. It was numbers on a page. Flights, shipments, bribes. It was strategy, a game, and he played it better than anyone else. But no game stays simple. The more money he made, the more attention he drew. From rivals, from governments, from citizens, and with attention came pressure. He responded the only way he knew how: control. If someone stood in the way, he moved them. If someone threatened him, he erased them. If someone doubted him, he reminded them. He didn't see himself as evil. He saw himself as necessary, a product of the world around him, a mirror held up to a broken system, a man who played by the rules he was given, even if those rules were written in blood. He didn't speak in ideologies. He spoke in results, and for a long time, the results were staggering. But results fade. The money that once seemed infinite became a burden. The favors he once called in with ease became harder to reach. The network frayed. The lies piled up. The silence cracked, and through it all, Pablo kept walking. Not faster, not louder, just walking. As if the end didn't scare him, as if it had already happened 1,000 times in his mind. And maybe it had, because beneath the kingpin, beneath the myth, there was still that boy, the one who watched, listened, waited, who understood the weight of a coin and the danger of a smile, who never trusted easily and never forgot a debt. The boy had built an empire. The man had buried it. And in the space between those two lives, a country had changed. Not completely, not cleanly, but permanently. And that, in the end, might be the strangest part of all, that a boy from nothing, with no army, no election, and no title, could make the entire world look at one country and ask, how did this happen? And for a long time, no one had an answer. Just headlines, just numbers, just echoes, the kind that don't fade. For some, Pablo's story ended on that rooftop. But for Colombia, it didn't end. It changed form. The shadow he left didn't vanish. It stretched. It settled into places he had never touched directly, into conversations, into policies, into the nervous glances of officials, still unsure who was listening. His death was a milestone, not a finish line. The work of undoing what he had built would take years, maybe longer. After the headlines faded, the real damage remained. Not in the form of cartels, though others stepped in. Not in the form of buildings, though many still bore the marks of explosions. The damage was quieter, deeper, in trust, in fear, in how people learned to live with caution as a habit, not a reaction. Entire generations grew up checking their mirrors, memorizing license plates, knowing that safety was temporary. And yet, life kept moving. Markets opened, schools rang their bells, families celebrated birthdays. But something had changed in the rhythm. The silence between sounds was different. It was shaped by memory, a time when a single man could bring a country to its knees using nothing but product and pressure. That kind of memory doesn't leave easily. It wasn't just the violence. It was the reach. Pablo had proven something terrifying, that with the right mix of charisma, calculation, and cruelty, a man with no office could outmaneuver entire institutions. And once people saw it, They couldn't unsee it. That kind of example casts a long shadow. It makes people ask questions they never asked before. Who really has power? And what does it cost to take it back? After his fall, the government made changes. More oversight, more collaboration, more headlines. But corruption doesn't end with a funeral. It adapts, just like Pablo did. The structures he used didn't collapse. They shifted, became quieter, more refined. The people who once took bribes didn't stop. They just learned to be more careful, and the world, watching from afar, took notes. Because Pablo wasn't just a Colombian story, he was international. His planes crossed borders. His money passed through banks in cities he never visited. His influence touched systems that claimed to be untouchable. He exposed how easily lines blurred when the price was right, how doors opened, how papers got stamped. And in doing so, he changed more than a country. He changed perception. In the years that followed, documentaries were filmed. Dramatizations were written. His face, once feared, became iconic. Not heroic, but familiar. And familiarity has its own kind of power. When people grow used to a name, they stop asking the hard questions. They turn it into symbol, into myth, into something separate from reality. But Pablo wasn't a symbol. He was a man who made decisions. And those decisions had consequences. Families were broken. Communities were torn. Children grew up without parents. And all of it was real. Not just numbers in a report. Not just dots on a map. Real lives. Real grief. Real people. And yet, within that darkness, there was a strange kind of clarity. His story made one thing impossible to ignore. The system was never stable. The cracks were always there. The difference was that Pablo didn't fall through them. He climbed, not because he was smarter, not because he was braver, but because he paid attention. And in a world that often rewards noise, he built his empire through whispers. That's what made him dangerous. He wasn't loud until he had to be. He didn't crave the spotlight. He used it. And when it turned against him, he moved back into the dark. He didn't trust easily. He didn't forgive. And in a strange way, he never truly expected to win. He expected to last, to endure, and for a while, he did. But endurance has limits. Eventually, even shadows run out of space. Even legends run out of time. Even fear loses its edge. Pablo reached the edge of that arc, and when he fell, the world didn't stop. It barely paused, because empires made from crime don't leave legacies. They leave consequences. And those consequences echo far longer than any name. So now, years later, when people speak of him, they speak in fragments. Some remember the violence. Some remember the kindness. Some remember only the fear. But few remember the truth in full. Because the full truth is never easy to hold. It doesn't fit into headlines. It doesn't sell well on television. It doesn't wrap up neatly. It lingers. It confuses. And it demands we ask not just who Pablo Escobar was, but what allowed him to be, and why no one stopped him sooner. For those who worked to stop him, the end brought little satisfaction. The officers who chased him weren't heroes in capes. They were tired men with bulletproof vests that barely fit. They slept in shifts, ate standing up, moved from motel to motel with radios that crackled more than they spoke, and even after it was over, the question remained, had they won, or had he just lost? Victory is a strange word when it follows a decade of fear. Some of them didn't make it. Their names never made the news. They were ambushed on highways, in parking lots, outside their homes, for doing their jobs, for refusing the envelope, for not stepping aside. Pablo didn't just fight politicians, he fought systems, and when people became part of those systems, they became fair game. Others survived, but with scars. Physical, emotional, the kind that don't fade with time, the kind that sit behind the eyes and surface when the doorbell rings unexpectedly. They carried memories of raids, of surveillance, of friends who didn't come back. And after it ended, they weren't celebrated. They were reassigned, transferred, forgotten, because even when the battle is over, the silence that follows isn't always peaceful. In time, the unit that tracked Pablo was dissolved. The task force disbanded. The files boxed and shelved. History moved on. New threats rose. New wars began, and those who remembered were left with stories. Some told them. Some didn't. Some still checked their locks twice at night. The people who lived in Pablo's orbit had their own stories. The accountants, the pilots, the messengers. Some claimed ignorance. Others claimed fear. Most claimed nothing, because talking brought risk. And after the empire fell, the only safe direction was away. Away from the name. Away from the memories. Away from the possibility that someone, somewhere, still cared enough to clean up loose ends. A few spoke up. Years later, in documentaries, in courtrooms, in books, they described hidden airstrips, coded conversations, stacks of bills so high they molded. They described a world built on secrets, and how those secrets eventually collapsed under their own weight. But others stayed silent, because silence was what Pablo taught them. Loose talk was a liability, and liabilities disappeared. That lesson stayed long after the man himself was gone. The city of Medellin changed too. Slowly, unevenly. It grew. New buildings, new roads, new ideas. Tourists returned. Investors arrived. And yet, beneath the surface, the past hummed. Old buildings still stood. Places where deals were made, where lives were lost, where fear lived in the corners of quiet streets. Guides offered tours, some tasteful, some not. Visitors posed near bullet-riddled walls, took photos outside houses that once held hostages. Some called it history. Others called it exploitation, but no one called it fiction, because Medellin had lived it. Every explosion, every curfew, every silence after sundown. And though the city wanted to move forward, and did, the past stayed close. Not as a wound, exactly, but as a reminder that power can rise fast, that loyalty can be bought, that silence, when left unchecked, becomes a shield for the worst. The next generation learned about Pablo through whispers at first, then through headlines, Then, through screens, his face became a lesson, a warning. Sometimes, strangely, an inspiration. And that troubled people, because when you turn a criminal into a symbol, even a negative one, you risk forgetting the real cost. The danger isn't just in remembering him, it's in remembering him wrong, as a rebel, as a genius, as something bigger than he was. But Pablo wasn't a cause. He wasn't a freedom fighter. He was a businessman who dealt in fear and profit and control. He wasn't rising up. He was pushing down, and the more people forget that, the easier it becomes for someone else to try again. So maybe the point of telling his story isn't to entertain, or explain, or excuse. Maybe it's to remind that behind every headline is a body, behind every fortune is a price, behind every myth is a man who once made a choice, and then made another, and another, until there was no turning back. In the end, there were no parades, no final speeches, no words carved in stone to explain what it all meant. Just a body on a rooftop, a country trying to recover, and a world left to sift through the pieces. Pablo Escobar had shaped history, but history didn't honor him. It studied him, dissected him, held him up as an example of how far things could go when power met opportunity, and no one said no soon enough. For his family, there was no peace either. His wife, once surrounded by wealth and protection, became a fugitive of circumstance. She changed her name, changed her country, raised their children under different stars. She wasn't guilty by law, but guilt clung anyway. To her, to the children, to the name. And names are heavy when they come with headlines. His son grew into a man haunted by his father's choices. He spoke in interviews. He answered questions no child should ever have to answer. He apologized, though the crimes weren't his. He tried to separate myth from memory, to say, quietly, that love doesn't excuse cruelty, that being a father doesn't undo being a criminal, that legacy is not the same as honor, and the name remained, Escobar. In some places it was whispered, in others, shouted, in bookstores, in classrooms, in the corners of the internet where fascination outpaces understanding. But the people who lived through it, the ones who had to rebuild what he broke, they didn't speak the name with wonder. They spoke it with weariness, as if it still carried weight, as if saying it too many times might bring something back. And maybe, in small ways, it did. Because stories like his don't disappear. They echo, they inspire, and not always in the ways people hope. Young men in other countries read his biography, not as a warning, but as a guide. They see the fortune, not the fear. They see the empire, not the emptiness. They copy the style, the voice, the violence, and the cycle continues, because power is tempting, and fast power is even more so. But Pablo's story, when told properly, isn't about success. It's about collapse, about how everything he built turned to dust, how every shortcut he took eventually led to a dead end, how the more he controlled, the less peace he had, how even billions couldn't buy him rest, or trust, or time. He died not in a fortress, but on a roof. not surrounded by loyal soldiers, but by policemen and concrete, not with applause, but with silence. His life was large, loud, full of movement, but his death was still. And that stillness says more than all the money ever could, because in the quiet, the truth stands alone. Pablo Escobar built something powerful, but not something good. And while it lasted, it swallowed everything. Friends, enemies, laws, cities, even his own family's safety. He didn't pause. He didn't reflect. He just moved forward, faster, deeper, higher, until there was nowhere left to go. And then it ended. And when it did, people stepped over the rubble, cleaned what they could, buried what they had to, and kept walking, because that's all you can do. In the years since, Colombia has changed, grown, fought back against the shadows. The scars are there, but so is the strength. Cities once ruled by fear now echo with music. Young people walk without looking over their shoulders, and though corruption still exists, it's no longer untouchable, because people remember, and remembering gives you a choice, to repeat or to resist. And that's why the story still matters, not to glorify, not to entertain, but to learn, not just about Pablo, but about the world that made room for him, the systems that looked away, the people who stayed silent, the roads that were paved with complicity, not coincidence. He didn't rise alone. He was lifted by fear, by profit, by a silence that spoke louder than any protest. And when the silence broke, it was too late. So now, when we look back, we don't do it to mourn him. We do it to remember what silence can cost, and how easily it can begin with one favor, one deal, one decision to look away. Pablo Escobar never expected to be remembered kindly. He wasn't chasing legacy. He was chasing leverage. Every move he made was calculated for advantage, not admiration. And yet, long after his death, people debated him as if he had been a leader, a philosopher, a visionary. But he was none of those things. He was a businessman, one who understood that fear opens more doors than charm ever could. Even in his early days, when he handed out money and paid hospital bills, it wasn't out of kindness. It was strategy, an investment, a way to buy loyalty without contracts, a way to build protection out of gratitude. And for a time, it worked. People shielded him, praised him. But even gratitude has limits when the cost becomes too high. Still, the narrative persisted, that he had helped the poor, that he had built soccer fields, that he had given when others had taken. And yes, those things were true. But so were the bombs, the assassinations, the bribes, the fear, the silences that weren't voluntary, the mourning that lasted far longer than the money ever did. For every favor he gave, there was a price someone else paid, often far away, often without warning. And yet the image remained of a man who rose from nothing, of a boy who outplayed generals and presidents, of someone who, for a moment, made the entire world look at one hillside in Medellin and wonder what was happening there. His power was never just local. It became global. Governments adjusted policies because of him. Airports changed their procedures. Cities modified patrol schedules. And in doing so, they acknowledged a difficult truth: that Pablo had altered more than just the drug trade. He had altered expectations. For criminals, he became a reference point. For law enforcement, he became a symbol of what happens when you wait too long. And for ordinary people, he became a question they didn't know how to answer. How can one man do so much damage? And how did it take so long to stop him? Because it wasn't just the money. Others had more. It wasn't just the violence. Others were more brutal. It was the combination, the calm voice, the clean suits, the precise decisions made from behind closed doors. Pablo didn't yell. He rarely made threats himself. He didn't need to. His reputation spoke for him. It spoke in folded envelopes, in unanswered questions, in empty chairs where judges used to sit, in birthday parties interrupted by sirens. And as the years passed, people stopped asking who he was. They started asking what he meant. That was his final trick: to become more than a man, to become a symbol, a lesson, a warning, but also, for some, a blueprint. And that's the part that frightened people most, because stories travel, and once they do, you can't control how they're received. Some read Pablo's story as a warning, others as a guide, and while the world debated, small groups in other places began building. Slowly, quietly, following footprints, not the ones in newspapers, but the ones he left behind in ledgers, in logistics, in loyalty, because that was Pablo's real talent. Not violence, not drugs, logistics. He understood flow of product, of people, of money. He understood delay, timing, leverage, how to move pieces before anyone else saw the board. And that knowledge, passed down in whispers, kept moving even after his death. It moved in new routes, new networks, new names. And each time, it carried a piece of him. Not the man, but the method. And that's what worried the world, long after the rooftop faded from view. That he had not just built an empire, he had taught others how to build their own. By the time most people realized what he had created, it was already too late. Pablo Escobar did not just smuggle drugs. He smuggled infrastructure. He built systems underneath systems. Quiet lines that ran beneath the loud headlines. Networks of people who knew only their task, never the full picture. He understood that knowledge was risk, and risk could be traced. So he limited it, fragmented it, kept people separate. And in doing so, he created something that could function even when pieces were removed. It wasn't genius. It was discipline. Where others chased attention, Pablo avoided it. In the early days, he stayed quiet. He didn't decorate his homes with gold or diamonds. He didn't drive the flashiest cars. He invested instead in loyalty, in silence, in routine. His wealth grew not from chance, but from pattern. Predictable routes, reliable payments, efficient schedules. There was order beneath the chaos, and that order was what made him so dangerous. Even when chaos erupted, it was planned. The bombings, the shootings, the threats. They were messages, not madness. Each explosion came with a purpose, Each murder followed a pattern. A judge said no. A building collapsed. A police chief spoke out. His car burned, and in this pattern, a nation learned to hesitate, to pause, to wait before making a decision. And that pause, however brief, was often enough. Enough for a bribe to arrive. Enough for a witness to disappear. Enough for fear to take the place of truth. This is how power works when it hides in plain sight. And while the world focused on planes and packages, Pablo focused on people. He knew that systems run on human decisions, that even the most secure vault needs a hand to turn the key. So he reached those hands first, with cash, with pressure, with promises, and when that didn't work, with reminders, not always loud, sometimes just a phone call, a glance, a pause, and people folded, not because they were weak, but because they were alone, because in his world, isolation was a tool. Pablo separated people, kept them dependent, kept them guessing. No one ever felt safe enough to speak, and if someone did, they were reminded why silence was safer. That kind of control does not vanish overnight. Even after his death, people still followed the habits he had trained into them. Officers hesitated. Judges checked their doors twice. Journalists paused before publishing. And families, ordinary families, waited to see if it was finally safe to breathe again. It took time, because fear, once learned, is not easily forgotten. And while the government replaced officials and passed laws, the deeper problem remained. Trust. How do you trust when every institution has been touched? When every uniform might hide a different allegiance? When every neighbor might remember a favor too well? That was Pablo's real legacy. Not the cocaine, not the headlines, but the fracture, the invisible line between what is and what might be, between who you are and what you can say. And that line takes generations to erase. In classrooms, teachers avoided his name. In homes, parents gave short answers to long questions. In courts, the past hovered in the corners. And yet, Colombia endured, because people endure, not by forgetting, but by moving forward anyway, by opening stores, sending children to school, planting gardens in soil once shaken by bombs, by choosing to remember without being ruled by memory. That's what makes a country stronger than its wounds. And slowly, that's what happened. Young people grew up not fearing his name, but questioning it, not repeating the myth, but researching the truth, not celebrating him, but studying him. And in that quiet shift, the power he once held began to fade. Because no matter how many stories are told, no matter how many shirts are printed, power without fear is just a story. And stories, eventually, are rewritten. There are places in Medellin where Pablo's name is still spoken softly, not out of fear, but out of habit. In certain streets, people remember. They don't always want to, but memory doesn't ask for permission. Some buildings were never rebuilt. Some walls still have marks. A chipped corner, a cracked window, a scar where something louder used to be. And those who lived through it can tell the story with just a gesture, a nod, a glance at the pavement. Not everyone talks, Some say too much has already been said. Others say nothing at all. But in those quiet places, the legacy isn't on billboards or documentaries. It's in routine, in how people watch the street before opening the door, in how cash is still counted twice, in how voices lower when certain topics come up. That kind of behavior doesn't come from imagination. It comes from history. And Pablo left more history than anyone ever asked for. The schools teach his story carefully. Not too much detail, not too much blame. Just enough to explain, never enough to glorify. Because the danger now isn't forgetting, it's misunderstanding. He's become a character, a role in a drama, a face on a screen. And faces on screens feel distant, like they never really lived. But Pablo lived, and he made others not live. And that part cannot be skipped. Tourism has grown in the years since. People arrive with cameras and curiosity. They walk the neighborhoods. They take photos of places once feared. Some ask questions. Some don't. Some want souvenirs. A shirt. A photo. A name printed in bold. And not all the locals approve, because there's a difference between learning and profiting, between asking what happened and selling what happened. But the line isn't always clear. Even well-meaning visitors sometimes miss the weight of what they're walking through, the homes that were searched, the cars that never returned, the days when families left in silence and never came back. These aren't stories for entertainment. They're pieces of lives still being rebuilt. And every snapshot carries a shadow. Still, the city moves forward. New buildings rise. Music fills the streets. Festivals return. Children laugh in parks once avoided. And yet, there's a quiet tension beneath the rhythm. Not fear, not regret, just memory, the kind that sits just below the surface, waiting, not to pounce, just to remind. There are families who remember differently, people who still see Pablo not as a villain, but as someone who gave when no one else would. Their memories are not fiction. He did help. He gave homes, medicine, shoes. But those memories are incomplete without the rest, without the lists, the names, the funerals, the ruins. Memory must include everything. The gifts, and the grief, the kindness, and the control. Because anything less is not memory. It's myth. And myth is dangerous when it looks like a shortcut. Pablo offered a shortcut. To power, to wealth, to influence. He didn't wait for permission. He didn't play by the rules. He made his own. And in doing so, he drew others in. People who thought they could take what he started and do it better, cleaner, smarter. But they all learned the same lesson. The path he walked had only one ending, and once you start walking, the ground disappears behind you. There's no turning back. The next generation sees his story through different eyes. They ask new questions. Why did the government fail for so long? Why did so many follow him? Why did the world only intervene when money crossed borders? These are the right questions, and they're harder to answer than any single documentary can offer. Because Pablo's story isn't just about crime. It's about silence, about what people do when they feel unseen, about what power looks like when it pretends to be generosity, and about how long it takes to undo what one man built with money, fear, and time. Time moved on, but the questions stayed. They didn't shout, they didn't demand, they just lingered, like the fog that slips through the hills at night, always there, never gone. Because Pablo Escobar did more than disrupt a nation. He shifted its balance, made everyone look twice, at power, at loyalty, at the very idea of law. He had shown how easily rules could bend, how fear could silence even the strongest voices, and how ambition, when left unchecked, doesn't just rise, it spreads. Across borders, through systems, into rooms where it was never invited. His reach wasn't measured in maps. It was measured in influence. Long after the planes stopped flying, his roots remained. In memory, in copycats, in whispers. Others took what he had built and changed the name. But the foundation stayed the same. Bribes instead of ballots, violence instead of debate, profit before people. And that pattern didn't die with Pablo. It simply changed faces. In some places, his name became taboo. In others, it became legend. Both reactions missed something, because neither fully addressed the truth that he existed because others allowed it, because doors opened, phones rang, eyes closed, and when the dust settled, everyone acted surprised. But deep down, no one really was, because power like his doesn't appear overnight. It grows slowly, it tests the limits. First a favor, then a debt, then a silence. And before anyone realizes, it's everywhere, hidden in contracts, in uniforms, in briefcases. And when it's finally visible, it's already too late. That's what made Pablo's story so difficult to explain. It wasn't just about one man. It was about what happens when too many people decide not to care. He gave them reasons. Fear, wealth, hope, a better life, or just survival. And in return, he asked for space. Just enough to move, to plan, to build, and little by little, that space expanded until it swallowed everything. And then came the consequences, not just the violence, but the cost. The long-term weight of letting one man become more than the law. The rebuilding took years, not just in infrastructure, but in spirit, in trust, in belief. And even now, those pieces don't fit together as they once did. The world outside Colombia watched closely. Governments studied his rise and fall. Police departments rewrote their manuals. Intelligence agencies adjusted priorities. And in every corner, one message repeated: never again. But words are light, and memory fades, and the conditions that made Pablo possible still exist in more places than anyone wants to admit. Corruption is not loud. It is quiet, precise. It does not kick down doors. It knocks gently and then walks in. That's why his story matters, not because of who he was, but because of what he revealed. The fragility of systems, the cost of looking away, the danger of delay. And yet, people still argue over him, still print his image, still debate whether he was a villain or a victim of circumstance. But these questions miss the point. The real question is not what Pablo did. It's what others didn't. What didn't they stop? What didn't they question? What didn't they risk to prevent it? Because in that space of inaction, he thrived. And when he was finally gone, what remained was not just damage. It was proof. Proof that no country, no matter how proud or prepared, is immune. All it takes is the right man at the right moment, with the right silence around him. And suddenly, the law bends. The streets change. The people stop speaking. And everything shifts. Pablo Escobar didn't build an empire from force alone. He built it from silence. And when he died, the silence finally broke. But by then, the echoes were already everywhere. As the years passed, the silence turned into questions, not loud ones, just steady, repeated, asked by students, journalists, survivors, people who had not lived through the worst, but who still felt its weight. They asked not just who Pablo Escobar was, but how a system could bend enough to carry him, how whole institutions, meant to serve the people, ended up serving one man, not because they believed in him, but because they had no better option. It wasn't that everyone was corrupt. It was that corruption became the easier path. Simpler, quieter, safer. And once that path was chosen, it became hard to leave. Pablo understood that. He didn't force people to join him. He gave them reasons to stay. A better salary, a promise of protection, a chance to be part of something big, even if that something was built on fear. Some of those people lived long enough to regret it. Others did not. And their stories still float beneath the surface of Medellin's streets, in old cafes, in rooms with curtains always drawn, in the glances passed between people who remember too much, not because they want to, but because they cannot forget. It's not the big moments they recall. It's the small ones. The phone call that never came. The road that felt unsafe. The face that stopped smiling after one too many close calls. This is what happens when power grows faster than protection, and when fear becomes currency. The laws tried to catch up. New policies, new security, new faces on the evening news, but none of them could fully erase what had happened. They could only try to prevent it from happening again. And even then, the work was slow, because trust takes longer to rebuild than walls, and longer still to feel natural again. In the countryside, some of the airstrips remained, overgrown now, forgotten by most. But if you look closely, you can still see the outlines. The gravel pushed aside, the tree lines shaped for clearance, a past hidden by grass, nature covering what memory has not. But nature does not erase. It only quiets. And some people return to see what was left, to stand where the planes once landed, to remember, not because they want to, but because they have to teach their children, to explain why things were the way they were, so that history does not become rumor, so that fact does not become entertainment, because too much of the world now knows Pablo Escobar through screens, through fiction, through voices that speak his name without weight. But in Colombia, especially in Medellin, the weight remains, and stories are told carefully, because they know what happens when stories are told wrong. They become invitations, And Pablo's story should never be an invitation. It should be a warning of what can grow in silence, of what happens when ambition meets opportunity, and fear is the only witness. He was not inevitable. He was allowed, and that's the part people often forget. That while he was building his empire, others were looking the other way. And every time someone stepped back, he stepped forward, until there was no more room, and no more turning back. This is why his story must be told slowly, without drama, without glory, without shortcuts. Because the moment we rush it, we risk losing the lesson. And the lesson is not about drugs. It is about power, what it looks like, how it moves, and what it costs when no one says no. By the time the final reports were written and the headlines moved on, something quieter had begun. Not rebuilding, not revenge, but reflection. People started to ask themselves where they had been during those years. Not physically, but morally. What choices had they made? What silences had they accepted? What excuses had they used to stay uninvolved? Because Pablo Escobar's rise was not built only on force. It was built on permission. Small permissions. Quiet ones. The kind that come when someone says, "It's not my problem," or "That's just how things are." And those permissions, stacked over time, became pillars. They held up his empire more than concrete ever could. Some of the people who gave those permissions had no choice. A threat, a child to protect, a family to feed. Others had a choice, but ignored it. And in the end, the difference didn't matter. The result was the same. The weight shifted, the rules bent. The man with the most power wasn't elected. He was accepted. And once acceptance becomes normal, undoing it takes more than laws. It takes time, conversations, honesty. And those are slow things, especially in places where honesty once got people hurt. In some neighborhoods, Escobar is still spoken of as a provider, a man who filled in where the state had failed. It's not that people deny what he did. It's that they remember what he gave. A house, a meal, a doctor's visit. And that memory, even decades later, is hard to argue with. Because it's not theory, it's survival. But a gift that comes with silence is not really a gift. It's a transaction. And Pablo was not generous. He was strategic. He understood that need can be more powerful than ideology. That when people are desperate, they don't ask about the source. They ask about the solution. And if no one else is offering one, they accept the cost, even if that cost is invisible at first. Even if it arrives years later in the form of fear, or grief, or something too quiet to name. This is why his story feels unfinished, because the questions it raises are not about the past. They are about the present. Where else might this happen? Who else is being allowed to grow unchecked? What silences are we ignoring today? And when will we realize it? Pablo Escobar is gone, but the systems that enabled him are not. Corruption doesn't retire. It adapts. It finds new names, new faces, new excuses. And it works best in places where people are too tired to resist, too busy surviving to ask questions, too used to disappointment to expect anything better. That's what Pablo understood. not how to force a country, but how to wear it down, little by little, until no one noticed what had been lost. And when the people finally stood up, they found themselves surrounded by rules that had changed, by walls they didn't build, by names they didn't vote for, and it felt too late. But it never really is, because every silence can be broken, every system can be questioned, every habit unlearned. It just takes effort and patience and the willingness to look closely at things that feel normal, because sometimes what feels normal is just something we've stopped fighting. And Pablo Escobar was the result of that pause. He didn't create the gap. He filled it with cash, with fear, with something that looked like structure, but was only control. And once control feels like order, it's harder to resist, because people will choose a cruel system over chaos. And Pablo knew that. He counted on it, and for a while, he was right. But systems can change if people stay awake, if silence is replaced with words, if history is told in full, not in parts, not in praise, just in truth. In many ways, the story had never really been about drugs. Cocaine was a product, a means. The substance moved fast, but the power moved slower. It worked through habits, through patterns, through the quiet agreements people made when they were afraid or tired or unsure of what the truth would cost. That was Pablo's real business. Not narcotics, but influence. He sold the feeling that nothing could stop him. And for a long time, nothing did. Each time a judge stepped down, each time a witness disappeared, each time a bribe went unchallenged, the myth grew. People stopped asking when it would end. They asked if it could end. And that doubt was more useful to him than any gun, because once people believe they have no control, they stop resisting. And when resistance ends, power becomes permanent, or so it seems. But Pablo's empire was never built to last. It was built to dominate, and domination, by its nature, creates enemies. He tried to control them, to silence them, to stay one step ahead. But the list kept growing. Officials, journalists, soldiers, foreign agents, even his own people. Anyone who knew too much, anyone who wanted too much, anyone who changed their mind. And managing that list became harder with each passing day. There were too many moving parts, too many secrets, too many variables, and even a man as careful as Pablo could not plan for everything. One slip, one message intercepted, one decision too late. That's all it takes when the entire world is watching. His fall did not come from weakness. It came from accumulation, too many fires burning at once, too many eyes in the dark, and too little trust left inside the circle. He had lived by control, but control is fragile, and when it cracks, it shatters quickly. He tried to hide, to run, to use the tunnels he had prepared. But the world outside was changing. The silence was breaking. The fear was lifting. And for the first time, he was not the one deciding the terms. He was reacting, and for a man like Pablo, reaction was not strength. It was the beginning of the end. Even then, he didn't stop planning. He never believed it was over. He believed there was one more move, one more escape, one more deal to be made, and that belief kept him moving, kept him calculating, until the rooftop, until the bullets, until the silence returned, this time without control. And yet, even in death, the story continued, because stories like his don't stop with the last breath. They stretch into books, into rumors, into documentaries and debates. They become tools, used by those who want to remember, and by those who want to forget, and by those who want to repeat. That's why the story matters, because it is not just about the man. It is about the space he filled and the lessons he left behind. Some clear, some twisted, some still unfolding. For every person who sees him as a warning, another sees him as a symbol. For every life he damaged, there is someone still arguing that he helped. That's the danger of complexity. It allows space for confusion. But confusion can be cleared with facts, with full stories, with voices that speak not from admiration, but from experience. People who lived through it, who saw what it did, who buried what it broke. Their stories are slower, sadder, but more true. And in the end, truth is what matters most. Not myth, not legacy, just truth. There was a moment, near the end, when Pablo Escobar stood in front of a mirror and didn't recognize the man looking back. He had lost weight. His hair had thinned. The face that once smiled in photographs now watched with suspicion. The rooms he lived in were smaller. The air was stale, and even silence felt hostile. He didn't speak much anymore. He listened, not to people, but to sounds, the creak of the floor, the birds outside, the rumble of a passing truck. Everything felt like a message. Every minute was a question. Was this the day? Would someone betray him? Had the world finally decided it was finished with him? His circle had shrunk. Those who remained were tired, jumpy. They didn't joke like before. They whispered in hallways, slept with weapons under pillows. They knew what was coming, and they knew that Pablo knew. But no one said it aloud, because saying it would make it real. And in their world, belief was the last defense. He moved between safe houses like a ghost, never staying long. The windows were always covered, the lights dim, phones dismantled after each call. He stopped trusting doorbells. He stopped trusting knocks. Once, someone laughed too loudly in the next room. Pablo thought it was a signal. He nearly shot the wall. Later, he apologized. Quietly. The man never came back. He tried to plan another escape. Maps were spread across the floor. Names circled in red. Smugglers contacted. Passports forged. A boat in a hidden cove. But even then, the plan didn't feel real. It felt like a ritual, a performance to keep his mind steady. Somewhere inside, he understood the truth. He was being hunted. And this time, it wasn't just by men with guns. It was by time, by momentum, by a country that had finally gathered the courage to say no. The prison he had once built for himself, La Catedral, had been a symbol of control, a place where he made the rules, where guards worked for him, where luxury sat behind bars. But that time was gone. Now, he was the one hiding, without comfort, without certainty, without control. And still, there were moments of habit. He checked the ledgers, watched the numbers. Even in hiding, the machine moved. Cash still flowed. Routes still operated. Orders were still given, but it was like steering a ship through fog. He felt the pressure but couldn't see the path. The empire was too large now, too fast. It didn't need him like before. It didn't wait for him. It ran on inertia, and he hated that, because Pablo had always been the center. Now he was a shadow in the corner. The man who had once dictated the terms of surrender now whispered to strangers through broken phones. He changed his name, wore hats and glasses, moved at night, and each movement made him smaller, not physically, but in presence, in weight. The rooftops no longer belonged to him. The streets weren't silent when he passed. The city had moved on, and he hadn't. Still, he tried to believe there was one more move, one more trick, maybe an alliance, maybe a betrayal he could turn, a deal with someone higher. But those doors had closed. The people who once answered his calls now refused to pick up. Some were gone. Others were in suits, giving speeches about justice. They had survived, and Pablo hadn't. In his final days, he sat in a room with no windows. A small fan buzzed overhead. A cup of cold coffee on the floor. He stared at the wall for hours, not in fear, not in regret, just in silence, listening, always listening, waiting for a sound that would confirm what he already knew, that the end was no longer coming. It had arrived. The final chase didn't look like the movies. There was no dramatic car crash, no explosion, no screaming radios. Just a quiet signal, a short call, a location narrowed, a few words passed between men who had been waiting for this moment longer than they cared to admit. Then footsteps, measured, not rushed, not loud, because even in the final act, caution still led the way. The building was ordinary. A low rooftop, wires stretched like tired veins across the sky. Inside, Pablo moved carefully. He was not pacing. He was not praying. He was thinking, repeating the same loop he had played in his head for weeks. What went wrong? Who had spoken? How close were they now? He had maps, but they didn't matter anymore. Not when the sound of boots was close enough to touch. His men were there, 2 of them, both nervous. One held a weapon too tight. The other kept glancing at the door. They had sworn loyalty. But loyalty is a strange thing when the lights flicker and the end feels near. Pablo didn't speak, Sane. He looked at them, not with anger, not with fear, just with understanding. He had seen this before, in others. Now it was his turn. Outside, the street was still. A car engine stopped. Doors opened, and then the silence broke. A sudden burst of motion, not chaos, precision. They had trained for this house, for this room. Pablo moved before they entered. Instinct, habit. He didn't run, not really, just climbed. Up 1 floor, onto the roof, into the light. The sun was out. The air smelled of dust and old cement. His steps were fast but not frantic. He didn't shout. He didn't cry. He reached for his weapon, not because he thought he would win, but because he didn't want to surrender. That was the one thing he had always feared. Not death, loss, humiliation, power slipping from his hands and being held by others. A voice shouted, then a crack, another. The air moved differently. Then the weight of a body, a stillness on the rooftop. No speech, no last words, just a man in a white shirt lying still. Blood drying too fast on hot concrete. The myth ended without music, without drama, without a crowd. The man who once held a nation in fear now held nothing. The photos came later, cold, clinical, exact, for proof, for headlines, for history. And still, even then, some refused to believe. They said it wasn't him, said it was staged, said he was still out there. That's how strong the myth had become. So strong that even his body couldn't kill it. But it was him, the man who built a prison for himself, the man who sent judges running, the man who offered peace with one hand and planted bombs with the other, now motionless, surrounded by broken tiles and armed men who weren't smiling, just looking, just confirming, just done. Back at police stations, the calls began. News anchors rushed to verify. Reports were written. Doors opened and closed, and the country held its breath. Not in celebration, not in relief, in confusion. Because when someone that large disappears, it leaves a strange space, a silence shaped like a person. What happens now? Does the violence stop? Does the fear fade? Does the story finally close? Or does it keep going without him? These were the questions no one could answer, because Pablo had filled so much space that his absence felt unstable. The structures were still there. The money, the roots, the silence. Only now, there was no one to command them. And everyone knew that power never stays unclaimed for long. The rooftop was cleaned. The sun kept rising. But somewhere, beneath the headlines and reports, people understood. This was not the end of the problem, just the end of the first name attached to it. The structure had not died, just the man who wore its crown, and people waited to see who would try it on next. The days that followed were quiet, in a way that didn't feel peaceful. The kind of quiet that comes after a storm, when everyone is still watching the sky. People walked the streets of Medellin with careful steps. Some looked over their shoulders. Others avoided eye contact. Even those who never met Pablo Escobar felt the shift. Something large had fallen, and the ground still trembled beneath it. Officials gave speeches. They said it was a victory, a new chapter, a step toward justice. Their words were careful, polished, meant to comfort. But behind the microphones, they knew the truth. Pablo was dead, but what he created was still alive, and it would take more than bullets and statements to undo it. The cartel didn't disappear. It split, like a river hitting stone. The smaller groups scattered. Some fought each other. Some tried to go quiet. Others wanted revenge. There were meetings, deals, blood. In rooms where Pablo's picture still hung, new voices began to speak. They didn't have his presence or his control, but they wanted his influence, his roots, his methods. The machine had lost its driver, but the engine was still warm, and the country knew it. People in high places shifted their alliances. They deleted numbers, moved money. Some retired early. Others changed cities, the ones who had worked with Pablo, but never admitted it, felt the air tighten. They watched the news with steady eyes, not mourning, calculating, wondering if the silence would hold. And for a while, it did. There were no immediate answers, no clear successor, just questions. Would someone try to take his place? Would the government crack down harder? Would things finally change? In the neighborhoods he once funded, reactions were mixed. Some cried, others stayed inside, a few painted over murals. Others lit candles. It wasn't all grief. It wasn't all relief. It was something more complicated, because people remember what touches their lives, and Pablo had touched many, with money, with violence, with silence. His house was raided, photos taken, records collected, the walls stripped. People looked for secrets, for answers, but mostly they found dust, fragments, lists without context, plans that never came true. In one room, there were toys, a television, a small couch. In another, a safe filled with old cash, curled and brittle. It was not the lair of a king. It was a bunker, and the walls felt too close, as if they still held echoes of the fear he once carried. Outside, journalists circled. The story was still breathing. Books were planned, scripts written. Everyone wanted to explain who Pablo was, why he rose, why he fell. Some blamed poverty. Others blamed corruption. Some said it was the government's fault. Others blamed the people, but most just repeated the same word: power. That was the center of it. The gravity that pulled everything in. He had been a master of momentum, a builder of systems, a man who saw opportunity in absence. And when he was gone, the absence returned, only now it was different. Now people knew what could happen if that absence stayed too long, if silence was left unchecked, if fear became normal. And so, slowly, very slowly, conversations began. In schools, in offices, in police stations, people started asking what they could do differently, how to stop the next one, how to build something stronger, not louder, just stronger. Pablo Escobar had shown them the price of delay, of hesitation, of assuming that someone else would act, and his absence, while quiet, spoke clearly. It said, "This cannot happen again, but the world is wide, and silence travels faster than memory." In the years after his death, the places Pablo Escobar had touched became something else. Some were left empty. Others turned into museums, unofficial and quiet, with guides who spoke only if asked. The walls did not advertise. The signs did not explain. There was no glory, just gravity, and people came, not to celebrate, but to understand what had happened and how it had lasted so long. The prison he built for himself, La Catedral, became a symbol of his arrogance, but also of the state's weakness, a place where he had lived with comfort, while pretending to be contained. Now, years later, visitors walked its corridors. They looked at the walls, at the view, at the silence. they didn't speak much. Some shook their heads. Others just stared. The absurdity of it all settled slowly. He had lived in luxury while people died in the streets. He had made deals while bombs echoed in public squares. And he had controlled the law while pretending to follow it. These facts were not in dispute, but they still didn't explain how so many let it happen. That part was harder to face, because it was not about one man. It was about what he represented, and what had to break in order for him to rise. There were efforts to move forward, new presidents, new reforms, new security policies. For a time, they helped. Violence dropped, order returned, but under the surface, some things remained the same. Money still moved where it shouldn't. Some names disappeared from the news without explanation. Whispers still filled corners. And people still learned, at a young age, when not to ask questions. Because systems do not clean themselves overnight. They resist change. They adapt to survive. Just like Pablo had. That was the part many missed. He had never operated outside the system. He had used it, found the cracks, filled them, bought them, made them permanent. And when the system finally turned against him, it was not because it had become good. It was because it had become tired of being outshined. Pablo had become too large, too public, too powerful. And power, once visible, invites enemies, even from friends. After his fall, others tried to follow the same path. None reached his level, not because they lacked ambition, but because the country had changed. It had learned, slowly, painfully, not all the lessons, but some, enough to make it harder, enough to slow the rise of the next empire. Still, the risk never left, because power always finds new ways in, new faces, new markets, new justifications. And people, even after all they've seen, still forget, still look away when it's inconvenient, still believe that someone else will speak first. And so, the story must be told, again and again, not loudly, not with excitement, but with clarity, because Pablo's story is not a legend. It is a warning about what happens when silence wins, about what follows when money speaks louder than law, about how easy it is to mistake fear for respect, and about how quickly a system built on shortcuts will collapse when pushed too far. There are still photos of him in small shops, some hung with pride, others as conversation pieces. A face behind glass, staring back with tired eyes. They do not glow. They do not smile. They just exist. Quiet reminders of what once was, and what could be again if people stop paying attention. Because Pablo Escobar was not a single man. He was the result of many small failures, piled on top of each other, ignored until they became impossible to hide, and that is why his name, even now, should not be spoken with awe, but with caution, with understanding, with care. The legacy of Pablo Escobar did not end with his death. It simply changed shape. His story drifted from memory into history, from history into media, and from media into myth. For some, he became a figure of rebellion. For others, a symbol of what should never be repeated. And somewhere between those two images, the truth still waits. That truth is not exciting. It is not glamorous. It is difficult. It is filled with names most people do not remember. Judges, reporters, police officers, mothers, children, people who never chose to be part of his world, but who were pulled into it by force, or fear, or accident. They are the ones whose stories are rarely told, because they do not fit into headlines or posters. But they matter more, because they show what was lost. Not money, not territory, but time, safety, trust. Every gunshot cost more than a life. It cost a little more belief in the world being fair. Every bribe traded a system for a shortcut. Every silence allowed a louder voice to rise. And the louder that voice became, the more people forgot what quiet could sound like, when it was real, when it was safe, when it was peace. The world has not forgotten him, and it probably never will. But remembering is not the same as repeating. To remember Pablo Escobar is to remember how quickly things can fall apart when the foundations are not guarded, when the small rules are broken, when the small warnings are ignored, when power becomes more important than people. That is where it begins, with a compromise, with a deal that seems harmless, with a favor that seems small. And that is how empires are built, not from ambition alone, but from the spaces that others leave open, the spaces where no one was watching, no one was listening, no one was brave enough to say no. And once that space is filled, it takes years to empty. Even now, decades later, traces remain. In policy, in memory, in the way people look when someone asks the wrong question. Colombia has changed. It has grown. It has endured, but it has also learned. Learned to be cautious of the next man with promises and power. Learned that the strongest walls are not made of concrete, but of people who refuse to stay quiet. That is what the end of Pablo Escobar teaches us. That silence is dangerous. That comfort can be a trap. That the cost of looking away is always higher than it seems. He rose because no one thought he could. He stayed because no one acted fast enough. And he fell because finally, enough people stood up. The rooftop where he died is quiet now. No cameras, no footsteps, just wind and sky, and the memory of a man who wanted everything and lost more than he could carry. Let that be the last lesson. Do not admire what should be examined. Do not repeat what should be remembered. And do not forget what silence can allow. If you've listened this far, thank you. If the story made you think or taught you something new, consider subscribing to the channel. Here, we tell history slowly, softly, and truthfully. This was Pablo Escobar, and this is Sleepy History.